All right, everybody, welcome back to SaaS Talks from Lead to Close. We have a special guest. I would call him my friend. I do call him my friend, Jonathan Mahan. He's the co-founder of the Practice Lab, and you've probably seen it around. But similar to me, he helps a lot of salespeople take sort of like theoretical sales knowledge and apply it through, like you said. I think when we first spoke, like the gym, like reinforcing that muscle. And so we're
Yeah.
going to talk about something that obviously I hold very dear to my business, which is demos, how to run demos. And the problem with most demos, at least from my experience, and Jonathan for sure experiences too from other folks, is that they focus too much on features, functionalities, capabilities, and it becomes not unique, sort of flat, like a typical, I don't know, like boring company presentation. And so I'll let Jonathan elaborate a little bit more about the problem that he's seeing and how to solve it. So if you're doing demos, whether you're an AE, founder-led sales, sales engineer, whatever it is, then this one's going to be for you. So yeah.
Hey, thanks for having me on more. Really looking forward to chatting about this. I can talk about this all day, but and I know you also probably will recognize and resonate with a lot of what I've had on my mind lately. So yeah, thanks for the chance to riff on it.
Yeah, let's do it. So prior to actually clicking record, you were saying that they're focusing on functionality, capabilities, and features instead of blank. What was that blank?
Yeah, I mean, I would say instead of focusing on use cases, on impact, on the business case that could be built, because ultimately nobody is ever going to buy anything just based on inherently how cool it is. The only time anyone buys something is when they have made the connection to how it's going to show up in their world, how they're going to use it, likely impacts it's going to have, and they're able to build a compelling business case for making a purchase, making a change based on that. But like in order for a purchase to happen, the buyer has to be clear on those points. They have to be clear on where they'd use it, when they'd use it, how they'd use it, who'd use it. They have to be clear on the impacts it will likely have across the organization. They have to be clear on what the business case is and what the pros and cons are, right? So the thing that I see happening all the time that frustrates me is that I'll be in a demo and I'll watch the demo, and what the seller's doing during the whole demo is just educating, 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 right? They're educating on what the product does. Sometimes they're even going as far as educating on common scenarios where the tool is used, which is actually pretty good. But they really shouldn't stop there because they just share all this information about the product does this, the product does this, the product does this, and that's it. And they shift the mental burden, the cognitive load of untangling all of that and figuring it out, where it all fits and why it all matters and what the business case is. They leave that work to the buyer to do. And typically the buyer ends up doing that on their own, maybe 3 days or a week later, when they can only remember the half of what you showed them, and without the benefit of having any previous experience in this area to guide them. They just have to do the best they can to like untangle and sort through all this information that was dumped on them to piece together on their own what is the business case and what are the impacts and what's the value. And like the buyer is probably not going to do that at all. But even if they were to sit down and carve out some time to try to do that, they wouldn't have a lot of success with it. Because again, in many cases, they never bought something like this before. So they don't have that benefit of experience to guide their creation of the business case. And in most cases, they've forgotten 3/4 of what they heard in the demo. So it's really hard for them to connect those dots on their own. So why shouldn't the demo be the place where those dots get connected? Why shouldn't the demo be the place where you do that interpreting between here's what the facts of our solution are and here's why it matters to you? So that's what frustrates me when I'm a buyer looking at a new solution and I have to do the work of figuring out why this matters, how I'd use it, what impact it would have, what the business case is. It's like, dang, can't we do that together with your help?
Yeah. I mean, do you think though it depends on the buyer? So if you're a buyer that's never used software before or this particular solution and you're evaluating it, you don't know what you don't know. So you actually need someone to do the connecting of the dots for you based on historical clientele. But if I'm a buyer that I've used this software and I've been using software like this, whatever it is, right? Like um we'll talk about like, I don't know, email engagement tools. You have Outreach, you have Mailshake, you have Mail something, whatever, you have all these ones, right? I've used a lot of them, so I don't necessarily need to be educated and connect the dots with these softwares if I were to schedule a demo. If anything, as a buyer that's coming from an existing solution where I have experience with it, I already know what dots to connect. I just want to know if your software can check off that criteria for me. So I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that in that case, it might be okay just to dump the information and let them figure it out. But again, that requires someone who has experience with you and multiple of your competitors, who not only has bought them before, but has used them before and understands the ramifications of each individual feature, and who is up to date on, the latest stuff, right? That what you offer. And I don't know if you're ever going to find a buyer like that, because truthfully, if they knew all of those things, they probably would just make their choice and buy, right, without talking to someone. But in the case that
All
you
right.
do talk to a buyer like that, that might be a special situation. But even in that situation, right, where again, it's a pretty savvy buyer. Let's say you have a differentiator between you and your competitor and how you do things, right? Maybe it's a calling tool, and there's something about the technology you use for assigning and routing numbers that means that you show up on spam, or you show up as a spam number less often. You would want to take the time with them when you present that feature to explain the technology, explain why it matters and how it influences the spam side of things, but then even give them the space to kind of think and process in their world, how important is cold calling, how important is that feature, what is the value to the business of that. So like, even if they're a pretty savvy buyer, if there's differentiators, if there's new features, right? If there's stuff under the hood that maybe they weren't aware of, you still want to go through that process of supplying the context of why it matters and giving them the space to kind of
Yeah.
think through what they just heard.
So how do you do that? So let's say A's like, all right, well, shit, I've been doing demos the wrong way. How do they now tactically take the problem and solve it? Like, what do they do on a demo? Like, let's pick one because there's multiple things that they can do. What's one thing that they can do right now, like physically, like do?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's two. We can tackle them one at a time. One is what you say before you show the feature. One is what you say after you show the feature. I'm actually of the opinion that most people could like dramatically increase their demo results by never even changing how they describe the feature. By just looking at what they say before and what they say after, you can make huge strides, because what you say before helps to set the context, helps to kind of prepare their mind so that when they see what you offer, they get why it matters and they're like, oh, hell yes, please, that's wonderful, versus just sharing the information with them and hoping it clicks and they recognize why it matters. So we'll start there, right? So before you show a feature, really you got two options in my mind. One is you set the context using a statement. The other is you set the context using a question. Either one's fine. I think I like questions better, but sometimes statements are a little bit easier to think up on the fly. But really, what you want to do is in advance of your demo, even think to yourself, okay, like what problem does this feature solve? And why does this feature matter? And how does having this feature impact my buyer's life? And really, I would suggest doing this thought experiment on your own. Like for each feature you
Yeah.
have, sit down and ask yourself, who cares? Why does this matter? What difference does this make? If you have a partner, even better, sit down with one of your colleagues and say, okay, as I talk about this feature, just keep interrupting me, be a rude jerk about it, and just keep asking me, why are you showing me this? Why does this matter? Who cares? Right? Like this can be a really good paired exercise, because ultimately, by thinking like 3 or 4 levels deep along that thought process of, again, why does this matter? What difference does this make? How will this affect the business? You as a seller can usually get some clarity on these features that maybe you didn't have, initially. But once you've got clarity in your own mind of like why this makes a difference, then you got to think to yourself, all right, what's something I could say in advance of this feature that would really help the buyer to come to these same realizations for why this matters, right? That could really describe the problem. So for example, you might create a sentence before your feature, which just simply says, hey, a lot of persona we've been talking to lately have been expressing some difficulties with blank. And that's all it takes. And then you can move on to, so here's the feature we created to address that. Or you could even start off a sentence like, hey, do you know what it's like when blank is going on and you start to feel a little bit blank? That could be another sentence to, again, set the context, set the stage, get them thinking about a particular need that they have, get them thinking about a frustration they have, get them thinking about a problem they have right before you show them the solution to that problem. And like,
So
this isn't all that, this isn't rocket science, right? Think of the last infomercial that popped up on your TV. they typically in an infomercial don't jump right into, here's
Yeah.
this cool vegetable slicer. What do they do first? They spend a few seconds showing a montage of the old way, of the hassle, of the difficulty, of the stress, of the problems, of the pain, and then they show you the solution. So it's
Yep.
not too crazy, but it's just set the context in advance with what problem you're solving. Direct them to think about and talk about a need that they have right before you solve that need.
Yeah, I talk about for at least my clients, I tell them say the why before the what. The what would be the feature. The why would be like why you're showing it to them. Why before the what. And
That's it.
one little like phraseology like thing that I'll tell them very basic. Use the discovery that you've done earlier on, whatever problem that they mentioned, and then bring that up and use that as the why. So, Jonathan, you mentioned earlier on that challenge. So, what I'm about to show you will solve challenge and then show the feature. Okay, so tactically, they bring up the why before the what. The what would be the feature, the why would be whatever pain point that either they're dealing with or someone like them is dealing with. Is there a second way to do this, or you would say that that's like the only proper way to do this to describe the why before the what? Well, I'm saying the why before the what. You're saying something else. It was same idea.
Yeah, my favorite saying for that is to make your buyer feel the gap before you fill the gap, is my version of the why before the what.
I
But
like
yeah,
that.
same idea. So context statement is one option. The other option is to use a question to accomplish the same thing, right? You can use the question to a question to get them thinking about and get them talking about an area of their business. So maybe, you have an automated tool that replaces a manual process. That might be a good time to ask the question, by the way, when it comes to end of quarter audits, what's that process look like for you? Then they talk to you about this, and then you show them, okay, well, it could just be this.
Right.
Again, if they're going to do a before and after comparison, it helps them to do that if you ask them about the before right before you show them, right, what that rosy future could look like. So
Yeah,
that's an example of a question.
I think it's important to side note, I call that a process related question. So you ask questions about their internal processes, but um I think I'm calling something out here that maybe some certain salespeople don't realize is that yeah, you have to spend a lot of time on discovery before you actually do the demo so you can actually set yourself up for a successful demo. But that being said, the discovery is very much sprinkled throughout and weaved throughout the demo. So like before you show a feature, you can ask a discovery question about their processes. So if you're on a discovery call and you're like, oh shit, I forgot to ask that question, or you didn't feel comfortable asking that question because you felt it was you were asking way too many questions, that's okay. Save your questions for before you show the features. All right, so we talk about the why before the feature, or the feel before the whatever, or the feel before the feel the gap
Feel the
before
void.
fill the gap. Yeah, feel the void before.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
What's so you show the feature? Do you just talk about the feature and the way you typically talk about the feature? Because you said earlier that yeah, you can totally not change anything about how you talk about the feature. It's more important about how you present the feature, how you lead to the feature, and how you sort of end that feature.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly can improve the way you talk about it, right? And honestly, more you have more expertise there than I do. I don't spend a lot of time coaching reps on how to talk about their features. Generally, I find they do an adequate job on their own. Again, where they lack is setting that context, the why before the what, as you mentioned. And then again, after the feature, kind of creating a bit of a discussion time is where the real gap is. But certainly while you're describing the feature, you can tie in some of what you learned. You can tie in some of what you mentioned. So for example, right, if you ask the question, what's your current process look like? And they describe a manual process. As you're showing the feature, it would make sense to kind of harken back to different things they had told you about their manual process and say, hey, do you remember when you said your manual process blank? Well, here's our version of that. See how different that is? And now you mentioned too in your manual process, there's a part where you do blank. Well, here in our system, and it's actually automatically connected. So like it definitely does make sense to adjust your talk track based on the discussion you had. But in my experience, that seems to almost come naturally, right? When we're doing practice with people in the practice lab, we really help them with setting the context. What I have found though is that when they've set the context, most reps naturally include some of that in their description of the feature. So generally it's my advice to like not focus a ton of effort on that part. That part's probably 80% of where it needs to be. The giant yawning gaps in most demos is again, setting the context before with a statement or a question, and then, uh, kind of creating a discussion time afterwards to help them think through what
Yeah.
they just saw and build a business case.
The way I see it, I'm a very I'm an immigrant to the US. I'm from Israel originally, so I have a limited vocabulary, so I use metaphors a lot. But the way I see it is, if you take the best cooked steak, I love steak, or lamb chops, and you s- put it on a paper plate, those flimsy paper plates with a plastic fork and knife, I will not enjoy the steak as much or the lamb chops as much as I should. But if you put the worst cooked steak on a really fancy, nice plate with the hotels room service, they put that thing on top that covers it, and then a really nice cutlery with a nice really satin cap napkin, whatever it is, and then you present to me. It could be the worst steak in the world. It will taste pretty good because the way it's presented. So I think the reason I'm giving this metaphor is because it goes to what you're saying. It's like how you present, it's all about delivery, not
I would,
DiGiorno.
I would, I would take it even a step further and say that regardless of the plate that you put it on, you could make people enjoy that steak more by, while they're waiting for the steak, asking them questions about why they like steak, asking them about the last time they had a steak, asking them about how they like their steak done, ask them to describe what a steak tastes like, and then give them the steak. Probably enjoy it even more because their mind just spent some time marinating in a void, a gap in their life, right? They have a steak gap in their life where they haven't tasted steak in 6 months, and they're thinking about that gap and they're remembering that gap and thinking about how it makes them feel and how frustrating it is that they haven't had steak in 6 months, and then you give it to them. So it's all
Yeah,
about preparing people's mind by, again, having them
priming
simmer
them.
and think about.
Yeah.
That's it. Priming them would be the right word for that.
All right. So
So
that's the before. That's the during. What's the after?
yeah, so the after is basically where you give them the chance to really process what they just saw, to connect what they just saw kind of in the abstract, in the theoretical on their screen, and connect it to their very specific day-to-day life. Because again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the episode, nobody is ever going to buy something until they've gone through the process of figuring out how they'll use it, when they'll use it, where they'll use it, what impacts it'll likely have on them, what impacts it'll likely have to the organization, what the benefits to the business will be, how this will impact their goals. Like, they're not going to buy it until they figure that out. So you as a seller get to decide, do they have to figure that out on their own 3 days later with no help? Or do they get to figure that out right here and now on the demo with me, with my guidance? Because I've seen this play out. I kind of know how this story ends. I can ask them the right questions to direct their attention to the right places in order to really form this compelling case. So in the practice lab, we call these anchor questions, but there's probably various terms for them. But it's basically a question that you ask right after showing a feature that gets your buyer to talk about what they just saw, how it relates to them, how they'd use it, where it would fit in their world, what impacts it would have, how it would help them. You ask those questions to kind of guide them down that thought path so that they can create a compelling business case in their mind right then and there on the spot with you, again, rather than having to figure it out days later.
So it's an example question. Someone's listening. All right, I know what to say before I show the feature. I know more or less how to show the feature. Worst case, I don't change anything about how I talk about the feature. I've finished showing them the feature. What question should I ask them? What's like the pocket, the what do they call it? Pocket knife? Not the pocket knife, the Swiss Army knife question they can ask.
Yeah, so I would say the Swiss Army knife question that you can ask, well, a question that you can ask in any situation, any product, any feature is something pretty open-ended and kind of broad, such as, I'm curious, as I was showing that to you, what was going through your mind? Like, it can literally be that simple, right? Or even just,
Super open-ended, yeah.
yeah, what are your thoughts about that? Or how are you feeling about this right now, right? It can be that simple. I will clarify and kind of make the point, though, that those questions are not, do you have any questions? Or does that make sense? Those questions are throwaway questions. I don't think you
Oh
ever
yeah.
get a meaningful
Not
answer to those.
I tell my AE students and my clients one thing to pay attention to is if a prospect has questions, number one, they'll just ask their questions. If it's like really like bothering, they'll ask their question. Second, and this is sort of in like adjacent to what you're saying is pay attention to if the prospect is proactively asking questions. If I remember I did a demo with a particular like marketing company software like 2 weeks ago, and I was like I had a high intent to purchase, and so I was asking a ton of questions. I was not a ton, but I was asking questions. Nothing prompted me to ask those questions except the actual demo. I just saw what I saw, and then I was like, okay, well, I was figuring out in my head like how would that work, and then I asked my question, which means it's coming from a place of of me sort of like processing some information. So let me sort of like simplify this, what I'm trying to say, because I confused myself for here. Um, if you ever see your prospect proactively asking questions, meaning you didn't ask them, hey, do you have any questions? What are your thoughts about that? They just automatically ask their question after seeing that feature. It usually means that what they're seeing is very much relevant to what's happening in their little work world. And that's what's prompting them to ask. They're processing something. And that's a really good sign.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. So yeah, don't bother asking any questions. And again, to your point, if anytime you hand them the microphone for whatever reason, if they have a question, they're going to ask it. So don't ask, do you have questions? Ask something like, what was going through your
Right.
mind? And again, they'll give you a question. So that's like a really universal one, right? Honestly, if the only change you ever made is you never again said, do you have any questions? And you just replaced it with what was going through your mind as I shared that with you, you'd be in great shape, right? It would be an improvement. But even that does put a lot of the work on the prospect to still figure out a lot of this stuff. So you can use specific questions to guide them a little bit more towards the value proposition or towards how they'd use it. So maybe you ask them, maybe you just showed them like a marketplace of integration options you have. You might ask them, I'm curious, which of these integrations do you think you'd set up first? Again, it's just taking the theoretical abstract, what they saw on the screen, and turning it into terms of their actual world and how they'd use it, right? I was working with someone this morning, and they sell sales training, and they have different modules on discovery, on demos, on negotiation. And their anchor question was simply, which of these modules do you think your team needs the most? Or which of these, I don't remember what they asked. Maybe they asked, which of these modules do you think you'd start with? So again, these don't have to be too complicated. It's just, again, taking what you saw and applying it to your world. Or maybe even just ask, hey, who in your team would be the most excited to see this feature? Right? Or, when during the course of a quarter, do you think you'd pull up these dashboards the most often? Again, these
So
aren't rocket science
yeah,
questions.
very situational questions, realistic questions. Assuming we'd be a fit, and you to start using this, and then ask your situational question. Yeah, for sure.
Situational questions work. You can, in some cases, even get more direct and again, help them to build the value prop by specifically asking about impacts, right? I think I was working with someone, did something with like restaurant software technology, and they asked a question of like, hey, how would it impact, the level of service your customers get if your waiters were spending 20% less time on whatever? So it was specifically asking about like, how would this feature affect customer satisfaction and service? So again, it was connecting a feature to a proposed possible benefit and giving them the chance to kind of think through it on their own. We talked about like engagement tools. So I was working with a company who has some kind of like a sales engagement tool to help with cold calling and deliverability and stuff. And one of their features was some stuff they do technologically on the back end to help your email deliverability be better. So after showing that feature, the rep asked the question, so if you were to get 50% more emails delivered than you're getting now, how do you imagine that would impact the rest of the funnel? So again, it's just giving them the chance and the space to think through, okay, I just saw a feature. What would be the repercussions of that feature? What would be the benefits I would see? And again, the buyer is going to have to do this at some point. And if you don't give them the time to do it in the demo, you're forcing them to do it on their own later without your guidance. So these anchor questions are just a great way to, again, hand the microphone over them, give them some space to think and process what they saw. But again, you
Yeah,
can make it easier for them by kind of directing their attention to different areas, directing their attention to impacts, directing their attention to use cases.
for sure. This may require a little bit more work, but what someone can do, again, more work. I wouldn't recommend it if you're doing more mid-market enterprises, reach out to customers, active customers that you have some sort of relationship with, and do the discovery, sort of like reverse engineer discovery, and find out what about the software or what about that feature they liked and what questions do they have about it. So they'll tell you, well, when I looked at that feature, I didn't like that, whatever it is. If you do this enough times, you'll be able to sort of extrapolate common internal questions that was going through your prospect's mind at the time, which is now their customer. And you can take those questions and then use those questions to ask. So, for example, if based on your like customer interviews, customers are like, well, how does that affect who's going to adopt this feature in my sales department? Let's say that was an internal question they had. When you show a feature, ask them like, who in your sales department is going to adopt that feature, you think? Something like that. Like, so using existing data to supplement your demos. Cool. So
100%.
we talked about the how to present the features before, how to actually say the features and what to do after the features. I mean, pretty much on time. So any last tips? And then if yes, no, you can, if this is the moment to plug yourself in.
Yeah, sure. So those are the main things that I'll rant about all day long. I'll say there's one other like really small micro behavior, which is just like an easy one for folks to adopt, which is never ever take any sort of a compliment or excitement from the buyer without exploring it further. So if someone says, "Ooh, I like that," don't just say right and move along. Say, what do you like? Why do you like it? How would you use it? Right? If someone says, "Ooh, your competition doesn't have that feature," don't just say, "Yeah, I know." So next thing we're looking at, pause and say, "Yeah, I know. What are your thoughts on how you'd use that feature?" Like those opportunities where they erupt with some kind of enthusiasm or compliment are a perfect opportunity to pause, give them the space to think through and process why exactly that matters. Because they know viscerally in their gut they like it, but they don't always have the time to piece together a real strong business case for like, how that's going to help the business. So never let a compliment or any enthusiasm go unnoticed. Take the time to explore it and ask a question a little bit.
Yeah, good. That's a good one. I think Charles Mulbauer had mentioned that to me once when him and I did a workshop together. I was like, oh, that's an interesting one.
Wouldn't
Uh,
surprise me. He's full of good stuff.
yeah, he's great. Cool. So before we end it, anywhere, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, Jonathan Mahan. The website of my company is thepracticelab.co. Basically, we're a company that helps sales teams to practice their sales skills in the same ways that like performers, athletes, and musicians practice their skills. So, for example, all these things that I've talked about for the last half hour, we have specific exercises built where you can not only think through this and come up with your own questions, but you can also like practice that moment of the demo where that question pops up so that it becomes second nature for you. And actually, we have something launching in April of 2023. It's going to be a free membership tier called the Practice Club, where you can actually come practice every single month alongside like-minded sellers who want to sharpen their sales skills. And actually, one of the exercises we'll be doing, I think in May, is going to be all about demos and how to make the demos more effective. So if you want to actually practice your selling skills rather than just filling your head with sales theory, that'll be a cool place to go. And we actually have a pretty neat way to opt in via text to make it easy for folks. So for anyone listening to this, if you can just text the word practice to 66866, it'll enroll you in that free membership tier, and you'll get a calendar invite sent out to you to once a month spend some time practicing your selling skills. So
Sweet.
it's a good way to try this on for size.
Excellent. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, man.